Melissa, we have members remote. So we'll go ahead and get started. And as you know, this committee reviews the operation of the Healthcare Stabilization Fund. And we make recommendations regarding the financial status of the fund. And every year we do this, and this is our annual meeting here. So let's go ahead and do some introductions here. And maybe we'll start off. Dr. Gleason, you want to begin?
Doug Gleason, OBGYN here in Topeka.
Carol?
Could you repeat that and turn on your microphone, sir? Doug Gleason. I am an OBGYN here in Topeka.
I'm Daryl Conradi with the Conradi Insurance Group out of Newton, and I'm the insurance representative on the committee.
Marvin Klebb, former representative.
Dennis George with APS, healthcare executive working for the healthcare organizations across the great state of Kansas.
Senator Holscher, are you on? If the remote could introduce themselves.
There we go. Good morning. I'm Senator Cindy Holscher out of Overland Park, Kansas. Happy to be here.
Good. Thank you for being remote. Senator Solentrop. No? Okay. Any other committee members who are remote? Dr. Concannon, if you could say hello to us.
Hello, I'm Dr. Concannon. I'm a recent chairperson of the Healthcare Stabilization Fund.
Good, thank you. And who else do we have remote, Melissa? Representative Prail, welcome. Glad to have you. If you'd go ahead and announce yourself for the minutes, that would be great.
Rich Prail, 7th District. Good morning. Sorry I'm late.
We just got started. You're here for the important part. Okay. Staff, if you'd go ahead and introduce yourselves. Melissa, you want to start off?
Good morning, Melissa Rennick with Legislative Research.
Randy Walters, Committee Assistant.
Jenna Moyer, Reviser, Statutes Office.
Sean Pesnow.
Dennis Nicholson. We're both for broadcasting services.
Jennifer Light, KLRD.
Thank you. We appreciate the introductions, and we'll get started. First, we want to review committee information and recent legislation, and for that, we'll ask Melissa Rennick from the Kansas Legislative Research Department to fill us in.
Good morning, Chairman Klebb, committee members. A reminder about today's meeting that the committee meeting is being broadcast and on the legislature's audio stream and YouTube channel. And in order to assist members of the public who are attending today's meeting, you are encouraged to state your name prior to asking a question or making a comment, or for certain, please use your microphones. For those listening online, the agenda and meeting testimony will be posted at http://kslegislature.org/li/. And if you select committees on the navigational toolbar, select Other from the drop-down list, you will find the Healthcare Stabilization Fund Oversight Committee, and that's where Randy has posted our testimony for today. Information that's been prepared for you by your committee staff, both KLRD and the Office of the Reviser of Statutes, is conveniently located in the folder Committee Resources for your use and reference throughout this morning's meeting. The documents in your folder, first, I'll just highlight a few of those. On blue paper, this is just information regarding the committee and the membership of the committee. And The committee's membership responsibilities are formally contained in KSA 40-3403B, and some of the discussion that we'll have with the recommendations will specifically speak to your responsibilities. With the ivory cardstock cover, you will find the last year's report that was published on behalf of this committee, submitted to the LCC, the Legislative Coordinating Council, as required by statute, as well as the legislature in our interim committee reports publication. You will find, beginning on page 3 of the report in what we call the gray box, these are the conclusions and recommendations that you all developed as part of your meeting last year. The first paragraph relates to standard language that this committee has continued and answers questions regarding your statutory charge, including whether the committee should continue its own oversight and monitoring of the Healthcare Stabilization Fund, and whether a second independent actuarial analysis of the fund is necessary. You will then find a series of comments and recommendations specific to the presentations you received last year from the Healthcare Stabilization Fund Board of Governors staff and its actuary. You will note you had several comments and conclusions last year with some concerns regarding information about the fund itself and some of the results that the actuary reported on. Implementation of 2021 House Sub for Senate Bill 78, which made some changes to rates and coverage options with the fund. Then you also had some comment on the investment policy and strategies. You heard from your insurer representatives regarding marketplace conditions and emerging headwinds. You again spoke to COVID concerns, as well as liability coverage for certain maternity care centers, and then continued some language that you have for several years now regarding the fund to be held in trust and not have any monies transferred to the state general fund. And then also finally, you directed your report to certain standing committees of the Kansas Legislature. In addition to that, you will also find on yellow paper, this is information our office prepares regarding the budget of the Healthcare Stabilization Fund Board of Governors and any contemporary issues that may have been identified for the approved budgets for fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023. I've also provided for you some language that Jenna is going to address in her presentation here shortly. This is language from the omnibus budget bill, so this is an opportunity to look at proviso language that was included in House Bill 2510 regarding coverage for a healthcare, to continue the definition of healthcare provider for a maternity care center that met certain criterion. And a proviso is a form of 1 year of law. So Jenna will speak to how the legislature considered some language this year regarding maternity care centers. And I have also just excerpted for your use. This is now the very complicated but clear definition of a healthcare provider that is defined in 40-3401, which is part of the Healthcare Provider Insurance Availability Act. And Russ will speak, our actuary will speak more clearly to those different classes of healthcare providers. But if you want to refer back to who is a defined healthcare provider and who is not a defined healthcare provider, this is the definition that is in statute. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions regarding the information presented or defer to Jenna from the revisor's office for her presentation.
Well, thank you for that. Committee, do we have any questions? Seeing none, thank you, Melissa. Jenna, from the revisors, you are up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I am Jenna Moyer with the Office of Revisor Statutes, and I'm here to give you an update on legislation that was considered or passed in the 2022 legislative session. The first, you may remember last year, this committee received testimony about maternity homes or maternity centers, as they're referred to in law, and there was a bill, Senate Bill 399, that would have amended that definition of healthcare provider in the Healthcare Provider Insurance Availability Act, and this change would have allowed maternity centers access access to that plan of last resort in the Kansas Availability Plan. That bill did pass out of the Senate and was recommended favorably for passage by the House Committee. And it came up on general orders, but was passed over on the House Committee of the Whole, and that bill was not placed above the line again and did end up dying. However, in the omnibus budget bill, which is House Bill 2510, a proviso was added that would deem a maternity center to be a healthcare provider for the purposes of the Healthcare Provider Insurance Availability Act if that maternity center is accredited by a recognized national organization or falls within the language in the definition in KSA 655003. This proviso will be in effect for fiscal year 2023, and its language can be found at the end of this memo. There was also a Senate Bill 502, which would have established separate licensure for and regulatory process for those maternity centers. Currently, maternity centers and childcare centers have combined licensure and regulations in Chapter 65, Article 5. This bill did not receive a hearing, and it died in the Senate Committee on Public Health. The second topic of interest was related to advanced practice registered nurses, or APRNs, and that was in Senate bill, passed in Senate substitute for House Bill 2279, and it amended the Kansas Nurse Practice Act, most specifically in KSA 651130, and it would allow an APRN to prescribe drugs without a written protocol with an authorized physician. This bill originally contained a Physical Therapy Licensure Act, which passed in 2021, so its language was stripped and then substituted with the contents of Senate Bill 454. This bill passed the Senate and the House, and it became law after conference committee on July 1st, 2022. This bill would also require an APRN to maintain malpractice insurance coverage and will require a national certification for initial licensure as an APRN beginning in July 2023. This bill also amended the definition of mid-level practitioner in both the Pharmacy Act and the Uniform Controlled Substances Act to reflect that the APRN would not be no longer required to maintain that collaborative practice agreement with the physician. And the updated version of KSA 651130 can be found at the end of this memo. And I will note that the Healthcare Provider Insurance Availability Act was not amended in this bill to add APRN to the definition of healthcare provider, although there is a section in there that would allow APRNs who are practicing as nurse midwives, which was done a couple years ago. So if you're a nurse midwife, you're already contained within that definition of healthcare provider, but not the APRNs who have this expanded licensure authority after July of this year, or July of 2022. The third bill would be related to occupational therapists in Senate Bill 440. It authorizes occupational therapists to provide limited services to patients without referral from an appropriate healthcare practitioner. This bill passed the Senate, the House, and became law on July 1, 2022. This bill would also require each licensed occupational therapist who is actively practicing in the state to maintain professional liability insurance coverage. Minimum levels of coverage are to be set by the State Board of Healing Arts through rules and regulations. And again, KSA 403401 was not amended to add occupational therapists to the definition of healthcare provider. And sections 1 and 2 of this bill were codified in KSA 655422 and 23, which I have included at the end of this memo. And the last topic relates to COVID-19 healthcare licensure. And this would have been done very early in the session. And this was House Bill 2477. And it temporarily amends certain provisions related to healthcare professionals and adult care homes in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first changes require the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services to extend renewal deadlines for occupational professional licensure certificate or registration, and to extend continuing education requirements mandated by statute or regulation. And it would allow KDADs, but not require them, to issue temporary authorization for individuals who were previously licensed by the department within the last 5 years who are in good standing without paying certain fines that would usually occur if you allowed your licensure to lapse, as well as temporary authorization for individuals with minimum training to act as temporary aides within a nursing facility, or an individual not previously licensed by this state or any other state to assist individuals who require minimum supervision or assistance with the activities of daily living. And this bill would also allow KDADs to issue provisional licensure to adult care homes by temporarily suspending certain standards and regulations related to physical environment, bed capacity, bed classification, and without approval by the state marshal if that adult care home were to submit a detailed checklist and plan for isolation and cohorting of residents in response to the pandemic. And again, those provisions codified at KSA 48969, which a copy is attached to this memo. And the bill also amends KSA 48965 to provide that no temporary license to practice a profession shall be issued unless that profession is required to be licensed, registered, or certified in Kansas. This bill also renews a statute in the Kansas Intrastate Emergency Mutual Aid Act that allows certain licensed healthcare professionals to provide additional services and recently lapsed healthcare professionals to provide those services, as well as adjust certain conditions of licensure in response to the pandemic. And the provisions of this bill, all of these are set to expire in January 2023. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that the committee has.
Committee, do we have any questions for Jenna? Seeing none. Thank you, Jenna. Appreciate that. Next, we're going to have a presentation from the Healthcare Stabilization Fund Board of Governors staff. And we'll start off with Russell Sutter. Welcome to the committee in person. We appreciate that after a couple of years of remote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As mentioned, I'm Russ Sutter from the consulting firm Willis Towers Watson. I serve as the actuary for the fund, and I'm here to report on the results of our analysis conducted earlier this year. As a reminder, our analysis is conducted based on the previous year-end data. So in this case, we were looking at experience through December. We report on that experience to the Board of Governors in March, that the board then uses for their fiscal year-end financial statements, as well as in determining the surcharge rates for the upcoming year. That would be the year starting this upcoming January. Our presentation should be within your materials, and we'll be going through the 11 pages of that. And I am happy to take any questions any member of the committee may have while we're going through it. Before going into the details of the presentation, just an overriding comment or two, in that we think the fund is still in a very strong financial position. We actually were pleased with the experience in calendar year 21. It did better than we thought. And while we have some concerns about some cross-subsidization of some providers to other providers, which I'll discuss a little later on, we think the fund remains in a very strong financial position, and that is counter to a lot of medical malpractice payers these days, where we're seeing escalating cost of claims in many jurisdictions. So far, the fund appears to have avoided that. So as a result, the board decided, and we think reasonably so, to make no change to surcharge rates for calendar year 23. That is, the providers will be paying the same next year that they provided this year, despite what we're seeing in the industry around the country being escalated costs of medical malpractice insurance. Turning to slide 1 of our presentation, just what we'll talk about is a bit of a history of the fund's revenues and claims costs. Our forecasts of the fund's unassigned reserves at June of 22 and a roll forward to June of 23. The rate level indications, in other words, what would the fund have to do to its surcharge rates to achieve its objective? Recent fund investment income, the experience by class of provider, and finally the recommendations that we made to the Board of Governors earlier this year. All of this is a subset of a full report that we issued to the fund in draft form in March and then in final form after the board made its decision in September. So if we can turn to slide 2, what we show here is a 20-some year history of the fund's revenues and its costs. In the revenues, we're just talking about the surcharges that it's collected, and that's in the purple line. And the costs are the costs of settlements and defense costs for all claims in the yellow. So for example, if you go back to 1999, that year, the fund collected approximately $10 million in surcharge revenue, and the claims costs that year were about $23 million, again, in settlements to claimants as well as the cost to defend those claims. Now, there are certain elements of the fund's financials that are not in this data, but that are significant. On the cost side, the fund has operating expenses, and those are about $2 million these days. And it also has transfers to the plan and to KDHE, and those can be pluses or minuses, but they're more likely to be outflows than inflows. But generally at least a couple $100,000 a year. So those are additional costs that would raise the yellow line up to sort of all costs involved. But on the purple line, this does not include the fund's investment income, which these days is in the neighborhood of $8 million. And that would, of course, raise and bring the purple line much closer to the actual cost for those earlier years. If you look at the blip in the revenue in 2015, you'll notice it spikes up and comes right back down. That was when the fund converted from charging rates on a fiscal year basis to charging rates on a calendar year basis. So as a result, we had this one period that was 18 months. And as a consequence, fund revenue in that period, which is 18 months instead of 12 months, was much higher and then comes right back down the next period. There are two major legislative changes that affect this graph. One was in 2014, when there were several changes that took place. One is we brought more providers into the plan, into the fund. And then we also expanded the eligibility for tail coverage at no additional cost. So that was a significant increase in the fund's exposures, both by having additional providers covered by the fund and providing tail coverage, that is coverage for claims that are reported after the provider becomes inactive. So there's a significant expansion in the fund's costs with that 2014 legislation. Kind of the opposite happened in 21. Last year, there was legislation that reduced the fund's coverage by changing how much the primary carriers will pick up before the fund picks up, going from $200,000 to $500,000. And that's why you see in the 2022 and the 2023 years, both lines are coming down. In other words, we expect the fund to shrink over the next few years as the effect of last year's legislation gets fully rolled into the fund's operations. Last comment on this slide. We've all heard a lot about inflation and interest rates over the last year. If you look at the yellow line, and considering that the number of providers in the system is generally growing by 1% to 2% a year, and we expanded the number of providers covered by the fund in 2014, I really don't see much inflation here. If you adjust for more providers, that yellow line over the long run looks kind of flat. And that's a little pleasantly surprising from a payer's perspective, that there really hasn't been much inflation in the fund's claims costs over this 20-year period when you adjust for the number of providers covered and the coverage provided to those providers. It's really quite remarkable that claims cost on a per provider basis has stayed relatively stable over this 20-year period. So again, I think this type of historical context is worth keeping in mind as we go through the rest of the fund's performance in this presentation. If there are no questions on that, we'll move on to slide 3. Again, overall conclusions was that calendar year 21 was generally favorable. Loss experience was better than expected, both for active providers and inactive providers. Assets at the end of the year were $14 million higher than at the beginning of the year. The investment yield, which had been shrinking and going down for several years, seems to have bottomed out and now may start going up with interest rates having escalated the way they have over the last year. We are concerned about a couple of classes being underpriced. We'll go into some details of that later on, but specifically hospitals and midwives. And as a result, our conclusion was that the fund's financial position at June of '22 was better than we had previously thought. There is a slight positive rate indication, meaning we think the fund has a slight need to raise rates to maintain its financial position at the rate it is targeted. But we were also very comfortable with the fund, the board's decision not to change rates for calendar year '23, as that was one of the options we presented to the board. If we can move on to slide 4. What we show here are the assets and liabilities as we projected at June of '21, based on what we told you last year at this time, June of '22, and then what we think we're going to tell you next year at this time for June of '23. So you can see at June of '21, when we were doing this analysis nearly 18 months ago, we thought the fund would have assets of $303 million, liabilities of $265 million for unassigned reserves or surplus or equity, all synonyms in this context, of about $38 to $39 million. Roll that forward to this year's analysis. We are projecting the assets at June of this year to be $311 million. The assets up to the liabilities up to $270 million, for a net position that's actually higher now than we thought a year ago, and we're up to $41 million. So again, roll this forward one more year. Here's what we think we're going to tell you next year about the position at June of '23. We're projecting that the assets will be just under $300 million. The liabilities will also go down a little bit, and the net position will be down to about $30 million. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we think the fund is going to get smaller in terms of its assets and its liabilities over the next few years as the impact of the 221 legislation takes effect on the fund's claims and revenues. Any questions on that? Okay, moving on. Some of the assumptions that underlie all of those numbers are on slide 5, in that we're expecting about $19.1 million in revenue in the current fiscal year. We do discount some of the longer-term liabilities, the liabilities for inactive providers while they are still active, because those liabilities extend out decades. We use a 2.25% interest rate for that. We're assuming the fund's investment yield during calendar year '23 will be about 2.7%. We are assuming there will continue to be full reimbursement from the fund's work on the KU and WIGME programs, and no changes in the Kansas tort law or fund law. And again, we made 3 suggestions for the board to consider. 2 of them involved small increases. 1 involved no change in rates. Some of the options for increases involved changing the rates by the type of class, because again, as I mentioned, we are concerned about some subsidies going on where some providers paying not enough relative to the amount of claims they're generating to the fund. Now, on the previous slide, we were talking about the fund's balance sheet. If you move to slide 6, we're now here talking really more about their income statement in terms of what we think their inflow and outflow of funds will be in calendar year '23. And the net purpose there is to say what's the need to change rates to achieve the fund's objective of sort of maintaining their unassigned reserves at a constant level. Next year, we expect payments for claims and defense costs to be about $36 million. Again, because we think the fund will start getting smaller, we have the liabilities coming down by a couple million in row 2. We're assuming administrative expenses next year of about $2.1 million. We've thrown in $200,000 for the fund transfer to the KDHE. And the fund, the board, when it made its decision last year about dropping the rates, taking into account the long-term benefits to the fund of the 21 legislation, they had a planned investment, and that planned investment as a result was about $8.4 million. So the net operating cost for the fund in calendar year '23, we expect a net of that investment to be almost $28 million. Now, the fund has two sources of revenue to pay for that $28 million. One is investment income, and we think investment income next year will be about $8 million. And the second, whatever you don't get from investment income, you've got to get from what you collect from the providers. And therefore, if you've got total costs of nearly $28 million, you're going to collect only about $8 million in investment revenue. That means you got to collect the difference from the providers, which is about $19.5 million. We don't think they're going to get that much next year. We think they'll only collect about 19.2 at the current rates. So since we think we need 19.6, but they're only going to collect 19.2, they have what we would term a positive rate indication. In other words, they need to raise rates by 2% in order to close that gap. So again, we think a positive rate indication of plus 2% based on a lot of assumptions, but a slight positive rate indication. And frankly, we're comfortable with the board's decision not to make a change given how small that rate indication is. If there are no questions, we'll move on to slide 7. Here we take a look at the fund's investment returns over the last 8 years. So for example, if you look at that first row, 2013, fiscal year 13, the average assets for the fund during that year were just about $260 million. It had a net investment income of $9.8 million. So the effective yield, the income divided by the average assets, 3.75%. And you can see going down that column 4 how the investment income dropped considerably over the next 5 years and then kind of flattened out beginning with 2018. We're assuming next year will be at 2.7%. Now, a couple comments about this page, because when we were talking about these results last year at this time, it generated considerable discussion about should the fund's assets be invested differently so it can earn more investment income. Again, remembering the trade-off that whatever you don't earn from investment income, you got to collect from the providers. And it's a very worthwhile discussion and probably should be held fairly frequently. But also keep in mind that last year when we were together, the S&P 500 was at about 4,700, and today it's at about 3,900. And the 10-year Treasury was yielding about 1.6%, and today it's between 3.9 and 4.0%. That doesn't make those conversations that we had last year inappropriate in any way, but it just shows that if the fund is ever going to get into investing in equities, it will need to have essentially a strong stomach because it might sustain a year where it has significant negative investment returns. So again, we're anticipating next year's investment yield to be about 2.7%. But if it can earn more from investments, that means less it needs to collect from providers. If we move on to page 8, beyond looking at results at the total fund level, we also look at results by provider class. And if you now want to turn to page 11, this was mentioned earlier in terms of the different classes that the fund has, and I'll just go over this for a minute just to describe the class system and how we look at it. If you look at the last page of the presentation, you'll see we've got the list of the 20-some classes that a provider can be slotted into. Our description, not the official description of what's in that class, what type of provider, the number of providers, and finally the amount that they are paying the fund in calendar year 22. So for example, if you look at class 2, this is your basic general practitioner, no surgery. We've got 5,900 of them, and they're paying the fund $851 in calendar year 22 for their fund coverage. Classes 1 to 14 pay a flat dollar amount, while classes 15 and above pay as a percent of their underlying basic coverage premium. That's why you see percentages there instead of flat dollar amounts. So if you want to keep this in mind, now that we flip back to slide 8, we look at the experience by each fund class over the last several years, both their claims costs, the cost to defend those claims, and compare that to how much they're currently paying into the fund. And we split all providers into one of 3 groups. On the left-hand side of the page, you've got providers whose loss experience is relatively good compared to the amount they're paying to the fund. In the middle, you've got those that are basically a wash. They're paying their fair share, for lack of a better way to put it. And on the right-hand side, we've got, in our opinion, those that are being subsidized right now. They're paying less than we think they should compared to how much claims they're generating and the cost to settle those claims. So for example, if you look at the right-hand side of the page, the class that is most inadequately priced from our perspective is class 17. Those are basically your hospitals, and we think they're underpriced by about 30%, that we would need to raise their rates by 32% to get them on level. Now, from our perspective, from an actuarial perspective, we'd like everybody to be in that middle column, that everyone's kind of paying relative to what their costs are. From our side of view of things, those on the right are being subsidized by those on the left-hand side of the page. And that's why some of the options we presented to the board was to have the group on the right pay more and make no changes to those on the left-hand side of the page. Again, this is a level of analysis that we conduct every year, and we'll freshen this up when we do our next round of analysis for the board in early '23. If we move on to slide 9, we'll talk about the changes in the fund's surcharge rates over the last several years. So for example, if you look at the first row, for program year 2011, that would have been fund surcharge collected July of 2010 through June of 2011. The board made no change to its rates from 2010, and basically everyone was paying the same that year. There was no variation. And those that were paying as a percentage were paying 40% of their underlying basic coverage premium. Going down that second column, you can see that we have some minuses, some pluses, but generally fairly modest changes in both directions. We did have some increases on the higher side. You can see some members of the program had an increase of 6% in 2020, but we also had some decreases sprinkled in based on the analysis that we just went over at a provider class level. Then, effective with this year, the decision made last year based on last year's legislation, there was a big decrease in rates to reflect the fact that the fund is going to be paying fewer claims because it now attaches above $500,000 per claim instead of $200,000 per claim. So we expect the fund's claim costs to be lower in the future as a result, and therefore rates were dropped significantly effective earlier this year. The final slide of our presentation on page 10, when we met with the board, we gave them what we think were all 3 reasonable options for them to consider in terms of what to do for surcharge rates in calendar year '23. And the first one was do nothing. We are comfortable with the level of surcharge they were collecting relative to the experience, and we were comfortable that no change was needed at that time. We also offered 2 additional options that would generate a little more revenue. Option 2 was basically try to raise everybody's rates a little bit, in this case 4%. And option 3 was a little more targeted. And you can see under option 3, we are going to raise class 17, the one that we think is most inadequately priced. We're going to raise their rates by 13% in option 3, whereas many providers would see no change in that option. So again, option 1, do nothing. Option 2, everyone pays a little bit more. Option 3, Some pay the same, some will pay a lot more to try to even out that page where we just showed the 3 columns, try to get more of the providers into that middle column. And the board chose option 1, which we were comfortable with because we thought the fund was doing fairly well at that time. And we'll revisit this again when we do our next full review for the board early in calendar year '23. So as a reminder, from our perspective, the fund continues to be in a very strong financial position, and we were pleased with how the performance was in calendar year '21. With that, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'll be happy to take any questions anyone may have on either these comments or any other aspect of our review for the fund.
Russ, do you take a look at the loss experience in other states relative to the loss experience we have on slide 8?
Very much so. Slide, in terms of investments?
No, the relative loss experience among classes.
Well, I have clients all over the country. Most are in healthcare, or most are in hospitals, but also with physician groups. And the hospitals in many jurisdictions are taking a beating right now. They're seeing verdicts and settlements that are well beyond what they saw 5 years ago. For example, I had a client who went to trial, and many clients in the healthcare industry are kind of reluctant to go to trial unless they think they've got a really good case. And they took a trial to a case that they thought they could settle for less than $2 million, and they got hit with a verdict for $41 million. And we're seeing a lot of that scattered across the country. Now, years ago, this was something that maybe we saw in Cook County in southeast Florida and maybe Detroit and Philadelphia areas. Those borders have gone away, and we're seeing it all over the country. In fact, I think it was around this time last year that a case in Iowa had a verdict for over $90 million, which was unheard of at the time for Iowa and really woke a lot of us up that every jurisdiction is subject to these very large jury's verdicts at this point.
And what about Kansas and Missouri as far as the Johnson County area and Wyandotte County? Do doctors like practicing over here better? Are we in a better position?
Well, I think you're in a better position than in Missouri. Missouri, I think, has a much higher average cost per claim than Kansas. I don't have a good feel for one county in Kansas versus other counties in Kansas, but Missouri has had its challenges over the last several years. I have a few clients in the St. Louis area that are suffering a lot of pain in terms of these high settlements and high cost of verdicts. Others seem to be weathering the storm fairly well. So it's a mixed picture from my clients in Missouri right now.
Any questions? Yes.
Dennis George. The question I have is that we look at the future, as we look at the high costs of those settlement, like the 90, is there any trend that helps the hospital and the physicians and the providers versus not? Is it more just the general environment of the juries? Is there more expectations on accuracy because we have electronic health records? When we start seeing a 2 million to a 90 million or a 2 million to an 8 million, what are you seeing in the actuarial? And this might be a Rita question. What are you seeing as the keys to get to that 90 million number?
I think there is a change in the attitudes in the general population about punishing the wrongdoer, alleged wrongdoer, compared to where we were 10 years ago. I think it has swung back to where we were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 2001, 2002, you may have remembered there were verdicts about the McDonald's coffee spilled, had a settlement for several $1 million. And then I think the pendulum swung from being very pro-plaintiff in those cases down to being more pro-defendant, probably bottoming out around 2012 and 2013. I think it has come up fairly significantly over the last 4 or 5 years. I'm not sure it's still going up, but it's at a much higher level in terms of the likelihood of a high judgment than it was certainly 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have one.
Yes, Darrell?
The asset level for the fund seemed to hold very steady. Did we not take any kind of a hit on the bonds?
I'm not familiar with whether the bonds are at market or at book value. You'd have to ask the members of the fund for that. But you're right, with the increase in interest rates from 1.6% to nearly 4%, one would have expected a market-based bond portfolio to take quite a hit, just as the stock market has over the last year.
Yes, Jerry?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, first, my apologies to the committee. I had another commitment that ran a little bit longer than I expected it would. I was a bit late. Russ, thank you for your presentation. Just full disclosure, I also serve on the Healthcare Stabilization Fund Board of Governors, and we've had a lot of discussion with Russ in the last several months about pricing and adequacy of rates and reserves. And I think the decisions the board made about rate stability during this transition time were appropriate. I supported that on the board. I guess I wanted to ask Russ, you observe this in much more granularity than we do on the board. Are the assumptions that we have been, that have been guiding our actions, do you think those still hold? This, and you kind of mentioned that the fund would be getting smaller because with the attachment level moved up from 200,000 to 500,000, and the fund's exposure now is just 500,000 on a claim instead of 800,000.
Right.
So do you still see that during this transition period that the assumptions that we've been relying on I realize it can all change, but based on what you're seeing, does it still look like a reasonable approach?
I think it does. And I think one reason for that answer is that the clients of mine that are in the healthcare business that are having bad results, it's not because they're having more claims. It's because they're having claims that used to cost $200,000 are now costing $2 million. They're still having the same number of claims, but in other words, it's a severity issue, not a frequency issue. And I think the fund is insulated from a big severity impact because it's exposed less now than it was a year or two ago. So the big severity problem that a lot of healthcare, particularly hospitals, are having right now, the fund is somewhat insulated from. And goes to a discussion we've had with the board about whether to offer higher limits of coverage. There would be more vulnerable to an escalating severity problem. So again, all this will be refreshed in a few months, but I'm not second guessing anything that I would have told the board, nor second guessing what the board decided to do with its rates for calendar year 23.
Certainly. See no further questions? Russ, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next, we have the Deputy Director and Chief Counsel, Rita Knoll. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am Rita Knoll. I'm Chief Counsel for the Healthcare Stabilization Fund. As has become tradition, I have two reports for you today, our claims report and a report on the self-insurance programs for the KU residents and faculty members. First, I'd like to present our annual claims report, and it looks like this in your packet. And this report concerns the excess coverage that the fund provides for our Kansas healthcare providers and tail coverage provided for our inactive healthcare providers. Now, a caveat, this report is no way going to dovetail with any kind of budget projections or any kind of actuarial. It's a snapshot of what happened to claims this past fiscal year. It does not include any expenses for claims. It's just looking what happened to claims this last fiscal year. And I'll focus on three areas: trials, settlements, and new claims. But to sum up, perhaps fiscal year 2022, given the disruption of the pandemic, I think things are getting back to normal, whatever that new normal may be.
So if you turn to page 2 regarding jury verdicts, this past fiscal year we had 16 cases go to trial involving 17 healthcare providers. I have listed the jurisdictions where those trials took place. We had overall 9 defense verdicts, 6 plaintiff verdicts, and 1 mistrial. And I think it's interesting to note that 25% of our cases, 4 cases went to trial in Missouri courts, and all 4 of those trials resulted in defense verdicts. We did have 6 cases that resulted in a verdict for the plaintiff, and 4 of those cases involved a jury verdict amount that involved a fund for a total of $2.7 million for those 4 jury verdicts. We are in our fiscal year 23 started on July 1 of this year, and so far we have had 6 cases go to trial. If you turn to page 2 regarding settlements, in fiscal year 2022, we had the fund was involved in the settlement of 75 claims for a total of $28.6 million. If you look at the numbers of claims, fiscal year 2022 looks a lot like fiscal years 18, 19, and 20 regarding the numbers of claims. But if you look at the bottom of the page, I like to follow what perhaps the severity of those claims, and I've put those 75 claims into categories of severity. And you'll note that the top level of severity, the settlements over $600,000, in fiscal year 2022, we had 21 of those claims fall into that top category, as compared to fiscal years 18, 19, and 20 with similar numbers of claims, but far less cases in that highest category of damages. And so I've been asked, why the severity? And I think the biggest reason, of course, is when a claim is made for personal injury, you have past medical expenses that was sustained by the claimant, past medical expenses and also future medical expenses. So given those 2 components of claims for damages is probably the primary reason of why we see an increase in the severity of claims. If you turn to the next page, of those 75 claims, of course, the primary purpose of the fund is to provide excess coverage for our healthcare providers. But the fund does provide tail coverage for our inactive providers. Usually, on average, we have 10 inactive healthcare provider settlements per year. And in fiscal year 2022, we had 9 inactive providers involved in settlement of claims. There is another situation in which the fund drops down to provide the first dollar coverage, and that is when a healthcare provider exhausts their aggregate coverage limit. Currently, it's $200,000 per claim, $600,000 aggregate. When the $600,000 aggregate is reached, then the fund steps down to provide the first dollar coverage. The amount of fund coverage does not increase, but we step down to provide the first dollar, and of course we are incurring the attorney's fees and expenses on those claims. And we had 2 such cases that occurred during this past fiscal year. We also had 6 cases of those 75 that involved a contribution from a carrier excess of the fund. 2 were hospitals and 4 were physician cases. So to get an idea of these 75 claims, the fund was involved in the settlement of these claims. Our contributions were $28.6 million. But to get an idea of the entire cost of these claims, you have to add what was paid by primary insurance carriers, and that was a little over $13 million. Then in those 6 claims involving an excess carrier, an additional $14.85 million, for a total of $56.5 million for those 75 claims. At the bottom of the page, I do keep track of claims that are settled within the primary insurance carrier's limits, not involving the fund. In this past year, we were notified of 101 additional claims that settled for about $11.5 million. If you turn the page, this is just shows through the history of the fund from when we were created in 1976 to date, the total numbers of claims involving fund coverage. We had this past year 75 settlements for $28.6 million. There were 4 verdicts for plaintiffs in which the fund obligations were $2.7 million for a total of 79 claims of $31.3 million. We did have 4 verdicts, as I mentioned, and really this was the first time since fiscal year 2018 that the fund was involved in the payment of a plaintiff verdict. Finally, on the last page, the numbers of new cases by fiscal year. And as I told my Board of Governors, of when I was putting all this information together, the one thing that surprised me was the number of cases for fiscal year 2022 was down by 44. I was so surprised I ran the numbers a couple of times and it came out, and that's where we're at. I was surprised at that. A little bit of history about the numbers of new claims. You'll note that from 2009 to 2015, we had a 7-year consecutive year decrease in the number of new claims. But then, if you remember, the legislature in 2014 added 5 categories of healthcare providers to the fund, the biggest was of which were the nursing homes. So it was not unexpected that the numbers of claims in 16, 17, 18, 19, we saw an increase in the number of claims. But I was surprised at the decrease in 2022, but I took a look. I don't, that's good news, but I don't think it's an overall trend yet, because for the first 3 months of our current fiscal year, 23, we had 91 new claims. So for whatever reason, I think suits were filed and claims were made July and August and September this year instead of May and June. It just happenstance of the calendar. So my prediction is next year, when we look at the number of claims, if we average it out 2023 and 2022, it'll be about the same as 2021. And Mr. Chairman, that's my first report. If you have any questions.
Committee, do we have any questions? Yes, Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the typical cases like the drop this year to 274, is there any trend on what type of cases they are? I mean, are there more orthopedics, are there more OB? Is there any nuances that you can see a different trend, especially, I don't want to use the COVID word, but is that the one that's picking up and other ones are dropping, or is there any kind of trend in the style of case?
Really haven't seen a trend. The only trend would be in that this year, as compared to the last 2 fiscal years, we saw a great number of COVID cases being filed. In this past year, we did not. So that's really the only trend I've mentioned.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Jerry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rita, kind of to follow on to Mr. George's question, I know we all were sort of unsure about how the long-term care industry, nursing homes, would weather those couple of years of COVID. Have you, and I know there are some claims, but what are your observations about that and how that looks? And are the allegations substantial, et cetera? Do you have any thoughts about what you're seeing?
Altogether, and I should have looked at this, we have between 40 and 50 cases against nursing homes right now pending with COVID claims. The first COVID cases were filed at the end of April of 2020, that early. And most of the cases, we have 6 nursing homes across the state of Kansas that have had cases, COVID cases filed against them. And 2 of the nursing homes primarily have probably 40 close to 40 of those claims, one in Wyandotte County and one in Johnson County. And those were the nursing facilities that early on got a lot of the cases were filed against them. So we, like I said, between 40 and 45, 40 to 50 claims. So far, there has not been any settlements involving nursing home claims. And the ones against those two facilities, the one in Johnson County and Wyandotte County, are being vigorously defended by the primary insurance carrier. They're in the throes of discovery. As you can imagine, during the pandemic, the discovery on those kinds of claims was very slow because the nursing homes were taking care of their residents and didn't have time to respond to a lot of discovery or depositions. Of course, the primary allegations are going to be that the nursing facilities did not follow the rules and regulations regarding COVID. The 2020 legislation gave some immunity for physicians and hospitals, but not nursing facilities. Then in 2021, the legislature did provide some immunity if the facility was in substantial compliance. And so there's where the rub is going to be, so to speak. That's where all the litigation surrounds. So, you know, at that time, if you remember back in COVID, our nursing facilities were dealing with federal regulations, state regulations, suggestions, guidelines from state, county, federal, and changed almost daily, if not weekly. So it is the discovery taking place on those COVID issues of whether the nursing facility met the standard of care. It takes a lot of discovery, a lot of, it's going to be a lot of claims expense involved in defending those claims. But I will say the primary insurance carriers involved are vigorously defending those claims.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly. The chair recognizes Senator Holscher.
Thank you. Senator Holscher with a question. On page 3, Rita, you were talking about the increase in severity of claims, and I just kind of missed what you said in terms of what you think attributed to that.
I think primarily it has to do with the cost. When a suit is filed, a tort action, for example, a malpractice action, and a claim is made, there's different components of what kinds of damages can be claimed. And for example, the claimants, one of their components is for past medical expenses. And another component of damages is for future medical expenses. So as medical care has not gotten cheaper over the last few years, and so as the medical expenses rise, the claims that can be made for those expenses also rises.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any further questions? Rita, thank you very much.
I do have a second report on the KU, if you're ready for that.
We are ready.
The second report concerns the self-insurance programs related to the University of Kansas. These programs were created to provide the basic $200,000 professional liability coverage, and they were created 30 years ago by the 1989 legislature. By statute, the fund administers these programs and handles the claims from first dollar. And then the fund seeks reimbursement for attorney's fees and expenses and for any settlements and judgments up to the $200,000 basic coverage. There are two separate programs. First is the KU full-time faculty members and the private practice foundations. And the second program is for persons engaged in residency training, and those include our KU residents in Kansas City, Wichita, and the Salina programs. Now, as a reminder, these self-insurance programs do not include KU Medical Center. That is the University of Kansas is a state agency, so its coverage is provided under the Kansas Tort Claims Act. Medical students are similarly covered under the Kansas Tort Claims Act, and if a suit is brought against them, their defense is handled by the Attorney General's office. These programs also do not include KU Hospital Authority. The hospital has private primary coverage, just like any other hospital in the state. First, I'll talk about our foundations and faculty program. When the legislature created this program in 1989, it created the Private Practice Reserve Fund in the state treasury. So on July 1 of each year, the foundations remit to this Private Practice Reserve Fund $500,000. Then, as the fund quarterly, when we have attorney's fees and expenses and any payments for settlements or judgments, we submit to the Private Practice Reserve Fund. And when that $500,000 is exhausted, then the state general fund picks up the remainder of reimbursements to the Healthcare Stabilization Fund. So you can see the program cost for fiscal year 2022 was $2.3 million. $500,000 came in the Private Practice Reserve Fund, and $1.8 million came from the state general fund. The cost of $2.3 million is an increase over last year. And I looked at my notes from my presentation before this committee last year, and unfortunately, my prediction was correct. I predicted that the program cost would be greater for this fiscal year, simply because the numbers of claims had risen from 41 pending claims to 54. So as you can see, we did have 10 settlements as compared to 4, or compared to 6 the previous year. So the settlement amounts did go up to from a little over $1 million to $1.3 million. And of course, attorneys' fees and expenses grew also. When the numbers of claims arise, so does attorneys' fees and expenses. Now for next year, I think we will still have the same amount of attorneys' fees and expenses. It may go up a bit more, but I am hopeful that we will not see as many claim settlements next year. I think the program cost will probably be about the same, but I think we will see fewer settlements this next fiscal year. At the bottom of the page is the Residents in Training program. Now, all of the costs of the program come directly from the state general fund. This past year, the program cost was $865,000, comes all from the state general fund. The good news, we did not have any claim settlements this past fiscal year. And we did have an increase in the attorney's fees and expenses because the numbers of claims against residents rose from 14 to 41 for the previous year. And the numbers, fortunately, the pending claims at the end of this fiscal year are down a bit. So I'm hopeful that fiscal year 2023 will look more like 21 than 22. If you turn the page, and this has got, since day one of when the fund started handling the self-insurance programs for the KU programs all through the years, you'll see for the last 10-year average for the Residents in Training program is about $980,000 a year. So this past year was a little bit below average of $865,000. For the faculty and foundations self-insurance program, the 10-year average is about $1.9 million. So this past year, we did see an increase. It was a little bit of an increase this past year. One thing to note, the last several years, I've included on this report the total number of faculty members and the total number of residents in training. And of course, for the residents, this includes those located in Kansas City, Wichita, and Smoky Hill. But for the faculty, you might note that the number of faculty has doubled in the last 10 years. And the Private Practice Reserve Fund amount of $500,000 has stayed the same since 1989 when the legislature created these programs. But one thing we need to perhaps think about is that primary insurance coverage increased last year's legislature from $200,000 to $500,000. We probably will be fiscal year 2024 before we see any claims with the different coverage levels, 500 primary and 500 fund. But something to remember is that when those claims start coming in, more of a settlement, if the settlement will come from the state general fund rather than the healthcare stabilization fund. For example, right now, if a claim would settle for $400,000, the fund would be reimbursed for the primary amount of $200,000, and then the fund would pay as its excess coverage $200,000. With the amount of the primary coverage increased to $500,000, the fund would be reimbursed for the entire $400,000. At the bottom of the page, these are the amounts that are incurred by the fund for those claims. As I noted this past year, we did not have any claims regarding residents, but we did have 10 of the 10 claims involving faculty members. 4 of those claims involved an amount greater than $200,000, and the total amount of those 4 settlements was $1.4 million that came from the fund excess coverage. And again, this amount is not reimbursed, but comes from the fund for the excess. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report.
Rita, going back to the nursing home situation, certainly COVID in 2020 and beyond that a little bit, very unsettling times, very uncertain times in a variety of ways. Is the legislature considering any other remedies or assistance?
I am not aware of that, of any legislative proposals before the legislature.
Do we have any other questions? Jerry?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Rita, I have 2 questions related to this part of your presentation. You noted that the number of KU faculty has essentially doubled in the last decade. And I know KU has expanded its reach. It acquired Hayes, I think that's changed, and it has a presence in Topeka now, in Great Bend, and now in Olathe, southern Johnson County. So that, what triggers, are they faculty or physicians at those institutions faculty, or in other words, indemnified by the state general fund, or are they separate?
To be pursuant to our statute, to be considered to be considered as a I guess I should say, to qualify under the state self-insurance program, a faculty member has to be a member of the foundation, and they must have a full-time faculty appointment. I think when the legislation was created back in 1989, that the faculty appointments were for folks who were actually supervising residents in training, because those folks would have would really get 2 checks, one from the foundation and one from the University of Kansas for supervising residents. Now, we do not have over 1,000 faculty members supervising residents, but they are, by statute, you would qualify for the self-insurance program if you have a full-time faculty appointment. So they are given a volunteer faculty appointment letter. You mentioned KU's presence. In Great Bend, none of those physicians are faculty members. In Topeka, I think there are 3 physicians, the St. Francis campus, who are qualified for the faculty. In Olathe, I have not heard anything what's going to be happening with those faculty.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, Rita, a follow-up question. You noted that, because of the action of the legislature to change the basic or the primary limits from 200 to 500 and the attachment point at the fund after that, that $500,000 that the private practice reserve fund, that's really just one claim.
It could be.
Yes.
It could be. I went back and looked at, currently, this past year we had 10 claims involving faculty, 4 of which involved an amount from the fund. I looked at those claims, and if those 10 claims had been under the new coverage limits, an additional $630,000 the fund would have been reimbursed from the state general fund. So if we had those same limits in place for these claims, the state general fund the fund would have sought an additional $630,000 from the state general fund.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions? Yes, Darrell.
Rita, what is the experience of the availability plan? Are those claims all reflected in here, and are you seeing increases or decreases there?
No, the plan's experience is not reflected in here, other than if a plan claim is tendered to the fund, and then the fund would have the excess coverage for the plan, for that plan insured.
So do you know how the claims experience has been with the plan? Has it been positive, or has it been
I
negative?
do not, but I understand that there was recently a plan meeting, and I think Clark attended that meeting. But I'm not personally aware of the plan's experience this past year.
Thank you.
No further questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we have the Executive Director. We welcome Clark Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here this morning with you, and we appreciate, as always, you devoting time to serve on the Oversight Committee. A lot of information you have received, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Insurance Availability Act, and then run through some statutory figures that we are required to give to you in a concise manner. So a lot of you know these things, but it's good to review every once in a while. I think that the Availability Act was established by the legislature in 1976, so that's been 46 years, I believe, and it had three principal features that have remained consistent. Number one, a requirement that all health care providers who are defined in KSA 40-3401, all of those defined health care providers must maintain professional liability insurance coverage. Now, of course, this amount has varied over the years, and currently, as you are well know, the provider has to obtain $500,000 of base insurance and then an additional $500,000 from the Stabilization Fund. Number two, the second principal feature is the creation of a joint underwriting association, the Healthcare Provider Insurance Availability Plan. This plan was created to ensure or to assure that if you are a healthcare provider, as defined by statute, and you are unable to obtain professional liability insurance, insurance would be available for you. And then number three, the third feature is the creation of the Healthcare Stabilization Fund, and we are here to provide excess coverage above the primary coverage purchased by the provider, and we also serve as a reinsurer of the availability plan. I'm going to move to the statutory report, which a lot of these numbers you've already received. Rita has certainly a more thorough rendering of claims and so forth. But number one, during the fiscal year that ended June 30, 2022, the net premium surcharge collections amounted to $24,452,941. Number two, The highest surcharge rate for a healthcare professional was $10,006 for the coverage level by the new statute of $500,000 per claim, subject to a $1.5 million annual aggregate limit. Kansas resident neurosurgeon who is licensed to practice in Missouri would also be subject to a 30% Missouri modification factor, resulting in a total premium surcharge of $13,008. Number 3, the lowest surcharge rate for a healthcare provider was $200. Primarily, this healthcare provider would be somebody who is a non-resident who is licensed in Kansas but does minimum amount of healthcare services in Kansas. So they are allowed a minimum premium of $200. That was increased at the last for the beginning of this year from $100. Number 4, there were 16 medical professional liability cases involving 17 healthcare providers that went to jury trials. And as Rita nicely described to you, 9 cases resulted in complete defense verdicts, 6 cases resulted in a verdict for the plaintiff, and 1 case resulted in a mistrial. And I would stop here just to say that we do appreciate Rita, and I know a lot of you have a long-term relationship with her and her team. She has 2 attorneys that also help coordinate all of the cases that we touch, and does an incredibly good job. Number 5, during the past fiscal year, there were 542 open claims that were closed. Of those, 13.8% of them resulted in fund obligations. There are 64 cases involving 75 claims that were settled, which resulted in healthcare stabilization fund obligations amounting to $28,612,433. This makes the average stabilization fund compensation per claim of $381,499. And these amounts, of course, are in addition to compensation paid by the primary insurers, typically at this point $200,000 per claim. And as has been discussed, that will change here in the future, again predicting probably 2024, when the base coverage will cover the first $500,000 of professional liability insurance. Number 6 in this report is just a statement on cash flow characteristics. Some of the numbers may not match precisely. Number 7, the balance sheet as of June 30, the end of the fiscal year, accepted by the Healthcare Stabilization Fund Board of Governors, indicated a total assets amounting to $310,120,249, and total liabilities amounting to $278,776,996. And Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to the availability plan, which I believe there is a you have information in your packet specifically provided by the availability plan, I believe. But one of the major components of the Provider Insurance Availability Act was the creation of this joint underwriting association, and it assures, again, that healthcare providers are able to purchase basic liability insurance. And the existence allows commercial insurers to engage in selective underwriting practices. If an applicant appears to be of a questionable risk, the insurer can refer the healthcare provider to the availability plan. During more difficult market conditions, Insurers generally become more selective and are less likely to accept new risks. They may decide to non-renew healthcare providers who have had an unfavorable claims experience or who have been disciplined by their licensing agency. And as a result, this means that during hard markets, more healthcare providers end up participating in the availability plan. The example I've given you is from 2004, when there were over 600 healthcare providers insured by the availability plan. The plan is governed by a board of directors appointed by the Commissioner of Insurance, and then the board of directors contract with a servicing carrier. At the board's most recent meeting, which was October 24th of this year, it was reported that there were 362 plan participants, compared to, again, the 2004 number that I provided above of 600. These are healthcare providers that would not be able to provide patient care in Kansas if it were not for the availability plan. Just for general information, if a provider obtains their insurance from the availability plan, and then there is an additional amount that they pay surcharge for the stabilization fund, a typical health care provider would pay approximately 36% more than their peers for the cost of their professional liability coverage. So there's certainly not an incentive for a provider to obtain coverage from the availability plan other than to, if they're unable to purchase insurance elsewhere. Recent legislation, Melissa covered that very well, but House substitute for Senate Bill number 78 increased the amount that a provider must obtain from a base insurance carrier from $200,000 to $500,000 per claim. And so we believe that the implementation of that went very smoothly, and we're very pleased to report that we appear to be well on our way and working with the private insurers. We just didn't have any big issues. I've provided some historical overview. I'm not going to go through all of that, but that's there for your use, if so desired, at your leisure. I want to just conclude that the Availability Act has been very successful in my estimates. As my friends here on I served with in the legislature know, during the time that I was here, I interacted very well with, as chairman of the Insurance Committee, interacted with Chip Whelan, who was my predecessor. Certainly had no idea that I would be following him, but it's been an absolutely wonderful experience. But the Stabilization Fund just plays a very vital role, and I saw it as a legislator. I see it even more now, and we appreciate your time and efforts to come and provide oversight and review and suggestions and so forth. And I want to assure you that any time that you have comments, please let me know anytime, and I would love to talk to you about suggestions and comments. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for questions.
Do we have any questions? Yes. Dennis?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for all the work you do with the Stabilization Fund, but one question, putting on my old CEO hat and CFO hat of a medical facility. As we look at the graciousness not to raise the premium for Class 17 this year, which was a 32%, if that trends go into the future, will we be able to keep that stable for our medical facilities, or will we have to address the increase that's needed to cover that cost?
Well, I think that, good question. I think that the Board of Governors, I have been very impressed, particularly in the last year, 2 years since a lot of the, we've had the medical, services community it's, with COVID and all of our stuff and changing legislation. The Board of Governors has examined the numbers and done just a wonderful job in trying to find the correct balance. And so I'm very confident that they will. So to ask your question, I obviously don't have specific on what they will or will not do, but I'm 100% confident that they will make appropriate adjustments as needed. And they were very concerned with softening the blow of the new legislation and making surcharges were reasonable. They made right choices. Right choice this year to not change the surcharges, which we love telling our health providers across the state that no additional surcharges. I know that those of you in the industry enjoy that too, but I'm confident that they will take appropriate action.
Well, I'll share that because that's very gracious this year, because that is a large number. And I want to just say thank you on behalf of the medical facilities, that we appreciate the Board of Governors and the fact that we're looking at the stressful time of all medical providers to try to look at our resources and keep it to a minimal in increases when there's so many items that are out of our control.
Thank you very much for that, and I will pass that along.
Clark, has there been any discussion about this nursing home situation and
about possible legislation and so
of
forth?
any kind, or any assistance or anything like that?
Nothing that I have become aware of. I try to keep my ears open, but Rita and I talk about that, and we talk about possibilities. We pass that along to legislators as they ask questions, but at this point, I'm not aware of anything.
And were there any other recommendations whatsoever?
From the fund at this point? No, at this point, no.
Other questions? Yeah, Jerry?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Clark, thank you. Along the chairman's question, I know that there was at least one group of nurse midwives that operated maternity homes, licensed, and they had legislation in last year to allow the certified nurse midwives are defined healthcare providers, but the facilities are not. And that legislation, for a variety of reasons, did not pass. Do you know if they intend to reintroduce that this year? Have you had any contact with them?
Excellent question. And yes, we have. I do not know. I don't know precisely what will happen, but we have kept the doors of communication open with the midwives, and in that particular case, certainly, and we'll continue to do that and help out. And we're not, we're here to help facilitate that. We're not, and of course, it would, if we took an official position, as you well know, being on the board, it would be the Board of Governors that would take an official position on that.
Thank you.
Very well. Yes, Darrell?
Thank you. Clark, as I recall, there was in some legislation earlier the ability for the fund to consider maybe offering an excess $1 million above what the fund limits are today. Is that being reconsidered? Are you thinking about that at all?
In trying to speak for the Board of Governors, I would say that they're obviously aware of that. I think they made a appropriate decision that we didn't have the experience to offer coverage at that level. I certainly think that they will continue to have that in front of them, and if there is a time when they believe that is appropriate, they would consider that. It could have been done at any time, But as I said, I think there was so many changes and so much. I think it was very appropriate of them to be very cautious and made the right decisions.
Looks like that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee.
We'll move on now to an update on the current status of the medical malpractice insurance market. And our first conferee is Tucker Poling with CAMCO. Tucker, welcome to the committee.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Tucker Poling, I'm Vice President of the Kansas Medical Mutual Company. You have the written testimony from our President, Kurt Scott. So I'm primarily here to just answer any questions, but I was asked this morning to come up and just give a few brief comments on the high points of the environmental factors that were discussed in Mr. Scott's testimony. Generally stated, claim frequency is either flat or actually a little bit below last year, which is a little bit of a surprise. But you know, a significant environmental factor is severity is up in Kansas as it is across the industry generally. So costs are up, settlement demands are up, the amount of settlements and judgments are up, and that's true for the plan as well as it is for the sector across the state and across the country, frankly. Now, the why for that is a question that has been debated a lot within our industry. I think factors that contribute to that, we're seeing more quote-unquote mega verdicts across the country where we have these unusually large verdicts that are driving up the indemnity prices generally. We have the macroeconomic factors of inflation that contribute to those things. And then in Kansas, we also have some factors that are unique to Kansas, such as the Hilburn versus Enterpipe decision, which drew the non-economic damages statutory cap into question. So that has caused demands to go up and has caused the price of indemnity settlements to go up as well. With that, I will refer you to Mr. Scott's testimony, but I'm certainly here and happy to answer any questions.
Jerry?
Mr. Chairman, Tucker, thank you. As to that last point, I know there was some question about whether the Hilburn decision is controlling or whether the Miller decision of, I think, 10 years ago, 2012, is controlling as it relates to medical malpractice. I don't want you to go out on a limb, but do you have any observations or thoughts about that? I realize we still don't really have a clear answer about which case controls in medical malpractice, or I guess I should ask that question. Do we have a clear answer yet?
Well, the answer is we don't have a clear answer, and that in and of itself is a problem because, as in any sector, lack of predictability, uncertainty is not a favorable environmental factor. So we don't know for sure. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of the weeds, in that Hilburn versus Enterpipe case, there was no majority opinion. There was a plurality of 3, and then there was another justice who concurred in the result. So there's a lot of debate within the legal community about the extent to which that serves as precedent and whether specifically it applies to medical malpractice claims. We, as a servicing carrier of the plan and as a liability carrier managing litigation, we are certainly preserving that issue and look forward to potentially that issue being clarified. But right now, there's significant arguments that would favor the argument that Miller might still apply to medical malpractice. There are also contrary arguments that suggest that Hilburn would apply and overrule Miller in the malpractice context. But again, I think the bottom line is there's that uncertainty right now as to what the non-economic damages cap what the effect is in Kansas in medical malpractice sector.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Tucker? Thank you for being here. We
Thank you.
appreciate it. Next, we have Dan Murray from the Kansas Medical Society. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dan Murray here today on behalf of the Kansas Medical Society and the Kansas Hospital Association. Tara Mays is in the audience if you have serious questions to ask. But unfortunately, Rochelle Colombo cannot be here. You've got her written testimony. She's traveling out of state for business, but wanted to be here in person to emphasize the importance of this fund and this committee and call upon you to continue both this committee and its oversight and, of course, the fund. You've heard the history of the fund. In January of '76, I was born, and a teenage Jerry Slaughter went to the legislature and urged them to pass the protections that are provided by this fund. It's been extremely vital to the stabilization of the medical malpractice marketplace in Kansas. We certainly ask that you continue and urge the legislature to continue its existence. It's been a very good success, a rare public-private partnership that has provided the intended outcomes of its enactment. There are new challenges, as Tucker pointed out. The Hilburn decision is murky. The inclusion of corporations having the ability to employ physicians. Certainly the marketplace will be disrupted, we think, by the authorization of APRNs to practice independently, so we'll see what impact that has. They're not defined healthcare providers, but certainly might have an impact on the malpractice climate in Kansas. And then finally, some tightening, hardening of the market on reinsurance has had an impact on the environment here in Kansas. So anyway, with that, I will close and certainly urge you to continue your favorable work. I know for Representative Prail, we are certainly going to miss you in the legislature and your leadership. You've been a tremendous asset for the community, so thank you.
Any questions? Dan, thank you for being here today.
Thanks.
We are moving right along. I think we'll just keep moving here. We have no amendments pending in the legislature that we're aware of. Are there amendments the committee wishes to discuss? Any recommendations or thoughts? Yes, Darrell?
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to make a comment in terms of the industry. I saw a chart the other day that about 80% of the medical malpractice carriers nationally were running a loss ratio in excess of 100%. It is really a difficult time for this class of business. And the fact that we have the Healthcare Stabilization Fund, that word stabilization fund is very meaningful, and it has really provided our providers, our physicians, our hospitals with rates that are far better than what we see nationally. It's a great organization. It had a lot of foresight in getting this put together, and I just would like to say that on behalf of the work that we do. So.
Darrell, thank you. I think that segues us well into our next discussion here. Generally, the committee talks about the need for continued oversight of the committee, and certainly the independent actuarial review and the importance of the Healthcare Stabilization Fund. Melissa, perhaps you could help us with a motion that we should have along these lines.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, if you will look to your report from the prior year, this committee traditionally comments on two parts of its statutory charge. The first being whether the committee should continue its work and provide oversight and monitoring of the Healthcare Stabilization Fund. And the second independent question, whether there should be a separate independent analysis of the fund, actuarial analysis, and whether that's necessary. You could certainly take a single motion to endorse and continue those comments in your report if you so choose.
Representative Prail is one of your last great acts. Do you want to make a motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Prail, I would move that we move along just like we have done in the past, and it needs this committee's oversight. This is a very important committee.
Do I have a second?
I will second.
Yes. Mr. Slaughter seconds. Discussion. Seeing none, we'll call for a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion passes.
Does the committee wish to address the need for separate independent actuarial analysis, or are you satisfied with the information presented today by the Board of Governors and its actuary?
Mr. Chairman, just to get a motion on the floor, I think we have long history with Mr. Sutter and his firm. I think there is no compelling reason to change. They do a remarkable job. I'd recommend that we continue.
I have a motion on the floor. Do I have a second? Doug Gleason seconds. Any further discussion? Yes. Dennis?
I would just like to give compliments, because being on this committee and watching the consistency, the accuracy, the professionalism of our actuarial team, we want to say thank you, because it's accurate and you've been very transparent with all the processes. And I think that's the key about this committee, is the transparency that we get to be able to review and keep that dialogue to our states and our constituents.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
Aye.
Motion passes. Very well. Melissa?
All right, Mr. Chairman, among the contemporary issues that this committee traditionally comments on in your conclusions and recommendations is the actuarial report and the status of the Healthcare Stabilization Fund, including the income and rate level indications Mr. Sutter commented on. Generally, this would be then commenting on the fund's financial position at June 30, 2022, which is slightly better than forecasted than 1 year ago, the slight positive rate indication for calendar year 2023, and the board's decision to make no change in the surcharge rate, which the actuary confirmed as an appropriate option taken. But that's traditionally one thing that the committee chooses to comment on, just to keep representation of what's happening with the balance sheet and the information presented. Do you wish to comment on the actuarial status?
Is that best done through a motion, or?
Yes, or you can do a combined motion, whichever is your preference. I can comment on the other contemporary issues.
Why don't you summarize for us the motion that you'd
Okay.
recommend?
The motion, if you wish to comment on the actuarial analysis, would be to comment on the fund's financial position at June 30, the comments relevant to the rate level indications, and no change in surcharge.
Do we have a motion?
So moved.
And a second by Darrell. Very well. Discussion. Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Melissa?
The next item would be the current and future impacts of House Sub for Senate Bill 78, and recognizing the rebalancing of claims and cost between the fund itself and between primary insurance carriers. You had comment from the Healthcare Stabilization Fund, from insurance carriers. Among those items would be the lowering of surcharge revenue, which you acknowledged in your report last year, the reduction from the 2021 rates by 48% to the 2022 rates, to recognize that there would be less claims exposure in that primary coverage on the fund itself. And then for primary carriers, there was a comment in CAMCO's language regarding the House Sub for Senate Bill 78 to say insurance is available and adequate, and there were not concerns about loss of coverage with the change in law.
We'll include that language. Second. Jerry Slaughter seconds. Discussion. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Motion carries.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the next issue of comment and that you've previously commented on would be the market conditions and comments from healthcare providers. There was significant information in the CAMCO testimony regarding headwinds and continued uncertainty in healthcare delivery itself and in the marketplace. Among those comments were that there was an increased claim frequency, not necessarily the number of claims, but the severity of that, the frequency of the severity, the large verdicts, which was also addressed in a question presented to Russ Sutter, that was also being experienced in other states, the limitations and tightening in reinsurance, and then also the lack of uncertainty of the application of Hilburn to the medical malpractice marketplace. There were also comments from the Medical Society on the Corporation of Physicians and APRN laws and whether there'd be an impact as well on medical malpractice.
We have a motion to include those comments. Darrell motions, Doug seconds. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries.
And Mr. Chairman, if the committee wishes to continue, you've been monitoring COVID-19 and reporting very accurately on what's been happening or what some of those concerns are. Among those that were stated were the, in Rita Knoll's testimony, was the slow development of COVID cases and the particular concern regarding cases involving nursing facilities. Separately, you saw in the report from CAMCO, the participation of nursing facilities in the availability plan has moved from 8 in 2019 to 58 in 2022. So that was certainly another, as you're looking for kind of trends that are happening because of COVID, those were a couple of things that were happening that might, and then also perhaps an acknowledgement in the increase in the severity of claims here would be appropriate as well in terms of past and future medical.
We have a motion to include that wording. Yes, Judge Slaughter. Second from Dennis George. Any further discussion on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries.
And Mr. Chairman, this may be appropriate to include in the impact of House Sub for Senate Bill 78, but also acknowledging the increase of settlements and pending claims regarding the KU foundations and faculty and the increased cost projection to the State General Fund. Both those are already currently increasing, and then what's going to happen in 2024 if the private practice reserve fund remains at $500,000.
Barry Slaughter.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I think I would move that we incorporate some language from that, because I think, I assume that the budget committees look at potential liabilities when they build their budgets, but it probably doesn't hurt for us, we're a bit closer to it, to note that the legislature may want to revisit that and just make sure that they understand that there is a potential for a greater demand from the State General Fund for faculty as a result of the changes made a year ago.
Especially with a group of new
yes, sir.
Legislators coming in January, why be extra important.
So that's my motion.
Okay, that sounds good. We have a motion on the floor. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Dennis George seconds. Further discussion?
I just want to comment that we're being very transparent here again, because there could be an increase, and we don't want to create a surprise with all the numbers. But they need to be tolerant to realize that things can change.
Very good point. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I have two more items. Does the committee wish to continue language regarding the fund being held in trust, since we've started a conversation about the State General Fund, and there has been concern about this reimbursement from the State General Fund in the past for the fund Board of Governors held in trust?
So we'll include that in on this current motion.
This would be your new motion.
Okay, very well.
Yes, sir. Please.
Sauter moves.
I'll second.
Dennis George. All in favor, any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries.
And finally, our last bit of housekeeping here would you like to direct your report to the standing committees? This meets your conversation about new members, particularly in the House. But traditionally, you have referred your report to the standing committees on health, insurance, and judiciary, as well as the appropriate subcommittees and budget committees for the appropriations process.
Anywhere else we should have it go? So it sounds like that incorporates it. Does that need to be motion?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's make that a motion. Okay, Darrell makes a motion and Douglas seconds. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman, unless there are additional motions.
Well.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I was listening to you through today, and you were talking about your concerns on our long-term nursing facilities with the issues of COVID, the lawsuits, and where we're at with the legislation of protection. And I guess as I look at the numbers and seeing the great work that CAMCO has done by providing coverage for long-term care and nursing facilities, and I apologize if I'm not using the correct terms because I grew up in a period that long-term care was the appropriate name. So I apologize if I'm not using the correct acronym. But I think listening to what you said, I think I, as a professional listening to the other discharges of getting our Kansans back to the right level of care, I think we need to continue that conversation of thoughtful analysis of how do we give protection to the long-term care organizations, because one, they were hit with an unforeseen, unplanned problem called COVID. Supply chains were not set up to protect nursing facilities in the same way as hospitals. And we had a lot of hospitals that were short because nobody in America was set up for the supply chain issues. So I just really respect your issue of making sure we're still protecting them in the correct way to make sure we're not increasing liability to the funds, but also make sure we got them in the program correctly as we look at the success of healthcare across the state of Kansas.
Melissa, could we take that articulate content in some way and make that a motion to include in the report to the legislature?
Sure. We could certainly acknowledge when the nursing facilities were added to the fund. That's a more recent group that has been added, and at the time, what the consideration for adding nursing facilities and the need for liability coverage, and then comment on some of this. Not only is there uncertainty in the marketplace, there's uncertainty for certain healthcare providers, particularly medical care facilities, including nursing facilities, and then speak to some of those concerns that would be much more difficult for that industry to cope with. The pandemic is a pandemic, and it's still having fallout and results that you will want to continue monitoring.
I'll move that motion.
Okay, second. Representative Prahl. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Now any further discussion? Jerry?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just a point of personal privilege, I also would like to express my admiration and thanks to Representative Prahl. He just represents the best of what a citizen legislature should be. And as a member of this board, he's been just a welcome addition to it. And Representative Prahl, I wish you all the best. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. An outstanding, reasonable legislator. Thank you. Any other discussion points? Very well. Certainly, we want to thank the legislative assistants here and the staff, and certainly the name that I deal with all the time is Melissa, and I appreciate all you do, Melissa, in helping to get the committee's work done in an organized, reasonable manner. So thank you very much. And with that, we are adjourned.